Small businesses are really vulnerable. They run into a number of challenges when it comes to assessing these small businesses and then monitoring these small businesses.
Hello, my name is Jason Reichl, and you're listening to Risk Management Brick by Brick. I'm fascinated with people who are helping build and maintain the physical world around us. On each episode of this podcast, we'll dive in with a risk manager, speak to them about how technology plays a role in this process. Hello, welcome back to an episode of Brick by Brick. I'm your host, Jason Reichl. Today, we're going to be talking risk with Rochelle Clarke. Rochelle, thank you for joining me. Just to kick it off, why don't we start with the CV? Where are you now? What are you doing? And then we'll dive into how you got there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jason, I'm delighted to be here. I am currently the founder of Continuity Strength, which is a risk management solution that's used by SMBs and risk and compliance teams that work with portfolios of SMB vendors. That's what I'm doing at the moment.
Solutions, does that mean consulting? Does that mean technology? Why don't we dive in a little bit what the word solutions means?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a risk management solution. It's completely tech, completely end to end. And what it does is that it makes vendor risk assessments and ongoing monitoring simple, easy, and consistent. For many organizations, vendor risk management is quite time consuming. It can be inconsistent, and in many cases, it's often overlooked. The monitoring component of it is often overlooked, especially when you're looking at a larger corporation that's trying to keep track of hundreds or even thousands of smaller vendors. So it's our mission, using our platform, to take that complexity off the table so that businesses can stay confident and keep moving forward.
Wow. Yeah, I know this firsthand, as a COI management platform, as a CRO for it. The CEO, COI or any of that stuff is a time and place. It's not the ongoing element of it, which is a major problem to solve. So I'm interested in diving into that. But before we get there, what led you to that role? Let's go into your background. We love to talk about and inspire the stories of how people end up in these positions.
Yeah, so I was a strategy consultant for quite a number of years. I think that's my foundation. Those are my foundational skills, strategy consulting. For quite some time, I was working at one of the big FMCG companies, a director out of their New York office. One of the things that I was tasked to do is oversee their business continuity agenda. Now, this is a big global company with lots of moving parts. So that's something that I was in charge of at that moment, at that point. A few years after that, I was still in the corporate role in another position within that company when we had a crisis of continuity in one of my own family's businesses, smaller business, accounting firm, owner passes away. No one knew where anything was. So there we were planning a funeral. At the same time, we were trying to keep this accounting firm in play and operational in the middle of tax season, of course. So actually, Jason, I was kicking myself because I was thinking, man, small businesses are really vulnerable, but I know the power of a business continuity plan.
Yeah.
Right. So that's when I kind of started putting, one and one together. And that was essentially the genesis of the product Continuity Strength that you see today. Of course, started out advising on business continuity planning for small to mid-sized businesses, but then eventually just decided to productize it and make it its own standalone product to make it easier for small businesses to use it. They can just go online, answer the questions, they get the business continuity plan. It highlights for them what their resilience gaps are, gives them a resilience score. Since then, they can now run a cyber scan to understand what their cyber vulnerabilities are.
Yeah.
So because we've made this so easy for the individual SMB to really take care of risk and manage themselves, manage their risk profiles, that makes it much, much easier for larger companies that work with portfolios of SMBs. I know your background is in VC, private equity. Mm-hmm. For example, you can think about a private equity portfolio, right? Lots of portfolio companies. How does the CRO of that private equity firm ensure that the portfolio of companies that they are investing in are really at the level that they need them to be. So we make it easier for, larger companies to manage the small businesses that they're working with, either as
I
investees
thought
or
you just
vendors
go
as
like
well.
this. I thought you just, cross your fingers and hope for the best. No, that's not the right.
Well, some do. Some do.
Let's get into the questions then, because I'm infinitely fascinated about this. I really believe in the power of technology to democratize and bring technology solutions down market. I think that is how we build more resilient businesses and build better capitalism. So the questions I have right off the bat is, what are the most significant challenges when you're in vendor management related to small and mid-sized companies? What are those real risks that everybody should be checking out for as it relates to this? What are red flags? How can you assess vendors appropriately? What are some of your insight here?
Yeah, absolutely. Working with smaller businesses, so vendor management teams, procurement teams that are working with portfolios of small businesses, they run into a number of challenges when it comes to assessing these small businesses and then monitoring these small businesses. One of them is resource constraints. The small businesses don't have risk teams advising them on how they can improve their risk profiles. And the corporate procurement team can't scale the level of oversight that's needed across thousands of SMB vendors, right? So resource constraints, I think, is the first challenge. The next is around the monitoring gap. So a lot of the focus it tends to be on onboarding vendors, but monitoring those vendors once they're in the door tends to kind of fall by the wayside, right? And it usually tends to be because of resource constraints. And then last but certainly not least, we speak about consistency. The assessments that are done of small businesses vary by vendor, by team, by year. So there tends to not be a lot of consistency in the space. So those are some challenges that larger teams face when it comes to managing vendor risk at that portfolio level.
Often that you're going to see all those risks. I guess, is it lack of knowledge on the part of someone who isn't a risk manager in these small businesses that are, that allow these risks to proliferate? Like, it's a lack of education? Is it a lack of planning? Obviously you built a planning tool, so I may be setting you up to say it's all about the planning, but why is this not prioritized? And time is an energy effort, but once you build the plan, how do people then make the time to execute the plan? Like, what's the pathway essentially that you see for most businesses to get their arms around?
Absolutely. So when it comes to smaller businesses, what you find is that many of them just have so many going on, and they tend to be resource constrained. So you have a few people wearing many hats.
Yes, right.
So you really don't necessarily have the captain of that ship who's looking out into the future, thinking about risk management. It tends to be a non-core activity that's only performed when it's absolutely needed. The cases where they would need a business continuity plan are if they're going for insurance, if it's required during the procurement process. In many cases, it is. However, these are some of the issues that small businesses face. It's just not a critical resource or a critical area that they tend to spend a lot of time in.
Right.
So
So
this
they're
is
usually doing it in response to a requirement of a contract to win an RFP, something like that. And then the quality of what they're putting out is not actually sufficient enough in order to accomplish their goal. Is that the reality of it?
exactly right. Exactly right. So you have, compliance teams are looking over, business continuity plans, and it could be something that the business just pulled a template from Google, from a quick Google search, and they filled in, which leads to the inconsistent completion rate when it comes to these business continuity plans. And in many cases, they lack some of the key components that will really ensure that business is taking care of their resilience.
Yeah. Well, if they're resource constrained, then that means that the solution has to use something like AI or something to reduce that resource constraint. So what is the role of AI and automation as it relates to solving this problem? And where is it working, and where does it still need some time to mature?
Right. So AI helps in a number of areas, primarily for companies, for risk teams. that have these large portfolios of SMBs that they need to assess and monitor, because it helps to streamline the assessments, the monitoring, and the reporting. Because at the end of this, these teams do have to report up on specific KPIs when it comes to the risk that the company is facing, and they report to the board, senior management, et cetera, and so forth.
Yep.
So AI certainly helps to streamline some of those activities. It really helps the small teams oversee thousands of SMB vendors. If you have a case where an SMB is using AI to create, some of these business continuity plans, for example, it helps because it makes the process a lot quicker. But in many cases, they do need to have some level of oversight as well, because they're not necessarily experts on what needs to be in versus.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So how does your tool, or how do you recommend that they do ongoing monitoring? So I understand, so far it could sound like a waterfall, right? You have the continuity plan, you sign up, you get a continuity plan filled out, you use AI, and you get maybe some consulting support if you don't have it. Now you have a continuity plan put into place. How does the ongoing monitoring work? How does that influence what kind of parts of their process that does that touch and that needs to be incorporated into that business's processes?
Absolutely. And that's a really good question. When it comes to doing the assessment, every vendor goes through a due diligence process when it comes to procurement.
Yeah.
And it tends to be quite an extensive survey or assessment that they need to complete. And our tool helps them to do that, right? Because it's all digital. And our tool also gives them that resilience score, a baseline resilience score. But Jason, you are well aware of the fact that things are changing so quickly in the environment in which we operate, right? A few years ago, vendors going through that due diligence process would not have been asked about their AI exposure or their cyber exposure, but those are areas that now are front and center, right? Because those are areas that can lead the companies that they're working for, that those could be major areas of vulnerability. So what our tool does is that it allows the smaller business to perform that initial assessment, gives them that resilience score. What it also does is that it ensures that that vendor is able to complete a similar assessment in 1 year, so that it's a consistent basis of comparison. And of course, they get that resilience score so that the risk teams are able to say whether or not the risk profile is improving or, going in the opposite direction, in which case some remediations may be necessary. The other benefit of that is the insights that we pull, right? Our tool is able to let the risk team know where the gaps are within their portfolios of SMB vendors. What this does is that it helps, because what you're finding right now is that in many cases, the risk and compliance teams have a one-size-fits-all due diligence process for evaluating vendors, right? The feedback that we've received is that, hey, small business vendors don't meet a lot of those requirements. They just, by the nature of the fact that they're smaller, they just don't, which means that you have a process that doesn't meet the needs of quite a number of vendors, right? Which can leave the company vulnerable.
Yes,
right? So that's an issue. Our tool is geared to small to mid-sized businesses, right? So we're not going to be asking them about, their SOX compliance, because we know it's just not there.
Yeah.
So this is what
it's taking this idea that maybe existed at the largest enterprise side of things, like the continuity plan itself, which can be very much like I'm just gonna be honest, an academic sort of risk management tool.
Yeah.
And making it more practical, and maybe even something that you do more often with these businesses throughout the process as they mature, and that you're basically checking back in them. So maybe over the course of working with a business for 5 years, you get to a full continuity, but you're doing it in bite-sized pieces that match the risk that that business is, that you're working at that level of the business with.
Precisely. Right. So we really, our solution essentially makes it fast, makes it repeatable, and makes it consistent. Right. Which is what you want in an assessment process.
But does this only work then if the larger organization has some ability to bully these smaller organizations into answering this? Or is it a process where both organizations see some value in the exchange of this information? Or what's the ideal state, I guess?
Yeah, so ideally it's not bullying because every procurement, every company, if you have a vendor that's coming in the door, you're going to be asking questions. If the vendor doesn't want to respond to those questions, that definitely raises some flags,
Mm-hmm.
right? I know that you asked about red flags in the very beginning. That's a red flag. Do you have a vendor coming in the door who lacks transparency and responsiveness?
Yes,
Right?
right.
Is that a vendor that you really want to work with? Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's an indication of a broader issue if you have vendors who don't want to go through the process. And in many cases, the procurement teams just kind of sideline them,
Yeah.
those types of vendors. So it's not a case where they have to bully them into creating them. It's part of the onboarding process.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's where it goes. Now, I'm going to challenge you just a little bit because my experience is working with risk management and technology and putting technology in with risk managers. Sometimes, like in the example of COI management, they've been doing this for a long time and then putting everything in a desk drawer or losing the file and just in a spreadsheet saying this expires at this point in time and have no real reference to it. And so they'll start with that baseline, right? And then they'll put in a piece of technology that makes this process ongoing. But they'll want to make a bunch of concessions. They still want to waive everything, and that inflates their risk appetite. And eventually they have no idea of what they've waived because they just waive everything. Is there a similar world in this, or where you have to educate the procurement teams at these businesses or the risk managers on strategies to go from, let's say, current state to future state? And if that's the case, what is sort of the strategy that you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, so, at the moment, as you mentioned, with any new technology, you're kind of jumping in midstream, right? So the question becomes, how much of the back work do you necessarily want to do? So in that case, you just weigh the pros and cons, right? If you do ensure that all of the small businesses, for example, have this in place, then you have that peace of mind that, hey, we're doing something to take care of risk and we can report up
Mm-hmm.
to members of the board, et cetera, and so forth. What you're finding now, Jason, is that many companies no longer have that option,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because in some industries, starting in financial services, they are required, right? Regulated industries are required to, in many cases, not only ensure the resilience of their own operations, but of the third party businesses that they work with, to, in some cases, the fourth party businesses and the nth party businesses that they work with. Right. So the position that many of those companies are in right now is not, hey, do we do this? But hey, we're required to do this. What options out there? What options are out there to help us to achieve this very, very quickly? Because we recognize that it can be time intensive and resource intensive as well. So in many cases, they really don't have that option.
Makes sense. Well, a fascinating topic. I appreciate that you are solving a problem around the ability to assess risk at the small, medium-sized business. Those are the ones that are most. A single claim can be so devastating that business may not exist after that, and the organizations that they often work for are not much more sophisticated than the organizations carrying out the work. I do a lot of work in construction, right? And so that sometimes leads itself to, the blind leading the blind sometimes in some of these scenarios. So I really appreciate that. Did you have something to add about that use case?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are a number of misconceptions about SMBs. Right. In some cases, the SMBs say, "Hey, we're too small to even matter." Right. But the sad part of the story is that many attackers often use SMB vendors as gateways to the larger organization. If I can give an example,
Please.
this isn't just theory. We've actually seen it play out. Take the Target breach. I think it was in 2013. Don't quote me on this. This was where the giant retailer Target was compromised through a much smaller HVAC vendor. Who would have thought, right? It shows that even the largest corporations can be brought down by the weakest link in their vendor chains. And the proliferation of tech through everything, basically every operator uses some form of tech, really makes the vulnerability of the larger organization so much more. So this is why vendor teams are now saying, hey, things are changing so frequently, one questionnaire isn't enough. It's not enough to ask them the questions and get them in the door. We need to have monitoring because risk can remain invisible if we don't, ensure that we have an eye on things.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely what I see too is it's often small vendor. It's a subs on subs on subs sort of situation. It's a property management company getting grounds work, and then everyone on the grounds is their own independent business. And then you lose that continuity, you lose the visibility down into those other organizations. And that's usually then when something happens and the job site gets shut down, the property management thing has a whole other thing to deal with, whatever those cases might be. So I think it is not feasible that being a small business these days in big industries means that you can't take care of these things or that you need to watch these things. In fact, it's almost more imperative than ever before because it's almost easier than it's ever been before to spin up a business, right? And so you really need to protect yourself there. So I really appreciate the work you're doing there. I often get asked when I do panels and things in the insurance industry that there is a gap of young talent coming into the industry. And so one thing I want to do is ask questions like, why insurance? Why risk management? What's cool about it? How do you jazz yourself up every morning to be solving this problem? And why should other people give a damn?
Yeah, because Jason, I saw it personally. I saw the impact of a lack of risk management personally on a small business within my own family. The story that I told, right? It was a personal story. It was a family-owned business, and without a business continuity plan, a disruption essentially more or less sidelined the business for quite some time. So this is actually one of the reasons why I took a step away from my corporate career to focus on this, because I recognized that smaller businesses were quite vulnerable. I also recognize that business continuity planning actually is a way that they can proactively protect themselves or insulate themselves from disruptions. It's not about predicting every disruption and completely insulating themselves from every disruption. It's about preparing so that they can adapt quickly.
Yes.
And that in many cases is the saving grace for many. And I recognize the knock-on effect. The FMCG company that I was working with, I recognized the fact that there were gaps when it came to ensuring that third parties that the company was working with were as resilient as they needed to be, right? Because any faltering in that particular area would have knock-on effects, severe knock-on effects for the larger company and organization. So I think this is one of the primary reasons why I took a step away from the corporate world to really pursue this, because I recognize, hey, this is a problem, but there is a solution out there. How can we make the solution that's out there fit the small business, the small businesses, as opposed to the small business needs, exactly, as opposed to, the big old telephone book business continuity plans that we're familiar with.
The academic ones, the non-segmented ones, which is, a model that we're seeing be disrupted pretty significantly. Yeah, great. And then one piece of advice that you would give to your younger self if you were starting this journey all over again.
Wow. Keep going.
Keep going. I love it.
Keep going. Yes. Yeah, absolutely keep going. Because, this is something that I started out being quite passionate about. But back in the day when I started speaking about business continuity planning, it wasn't as popular. For better or worse, the pandemic really opened people's eyes to the fact that, hey, we need to take some proactive action in this area.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that would be the advice to myself,
What a wonderful conversation to have. I really appreciate everything you're doing for the industry and for bringing awareness to something that is absolutely critically a problem, and making it easier by enabling it with technology. Kudos to you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely, Jason. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. I'll see you soon. Bye.
This sounds good.
Risk Management Brick by Brick is brought to you by TrustLayer. Find out how TrustLayer manages risk so that the people can build the physical world around us. Head over to TrustLayer.io, and then make sure to subscribe to Risk Management Brick by Brick on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. On behalf of the TrustLayer team, thank you for listening.